So my name is Gino, and I'm the founder of the Meridian Cacao Company. We are a 2-year-old cocoa bean importer based here in Portland, Oregon. We work directly for cocoa farmers to import and distribute their harvest to an exciting new genre of micro-roasting chocolate makers that are coined bean-to-bar chocolate. So I'm going to give you a very brief narrative of this emerging industry and to address and hopefully answer probably the most frequently asked question us bean-to-bar chocolate makers and people in this new industry are constantly being asked by consumers and retailers. And it's typically with very negative connotations when they ask, why isn't your chocolate fair trade? And so we are going to dig into whether fair trade chocolate is really fair and compared to what. So it's one of my favorite things to say when talking about chocolate, but chocolate is amidst a renaissance. On the production side, you can easily draw parallels to the dawn of the craft brewery industry 25 years ago and the micro roaster coffee house explosion that kind of followed shortly after. And on the demand side, we consumers have embraced the change socially and with our dollars. You know, we live in a world now where we gladly pay $3 for a cup of coffee and $5 for a microbrew. When 20 years ago, even adjusted for inflation, would probably be preposterous. So to help paint the picture, there's a big difference between a chocolate maker and a chocolatier. A chocolate maker is one who sources, roasts, and grinds cocoa beans, and a chocolatier is someone who takes chocolate and melts them, adds inclusions to create bonbons and truffles and whatnot. The later being what you have traditionally seen in the malls and chocolate shops, like all over the place. Bean-to-bar chocolate is typically just 2 ingredients. It's single origin or single estate cocoa beans and sugar. And I would say the industry as a whole is kind of taking the winemaker's approach. The goal is to celebrate different terroir and genetics, and as a business, you differentiate yourself from industrial chocolate by focusing solely on quality, and you celebrate the fact that batch-to-batch variance is not a bad thing, as opposed to, say, Hershey's, which has tasted the same somehow for over 60 years. And to say chocolate is amidst a renaissance is bold, but the numbers don't lie. 8 years ago, there were 6 micro bean-to-bar chocolate makers in the US. Today, there's 120. At this moment, we have 8 here in Oregon, 7 here in Portlandia, all within the last 5 years. While the bean-to-bar movement was arguably started in the US, it spread all over the developed world, and I'd be willing to place a bet that in the next 20 years, every city with a craft brewery and an independent coffee roaster will have a bean-to-bar chocolate maker. And so I think for all intents and purposes, it's safe to say that this is not a fad, and it is indeed an evolution in the chocolate industry. And we as consumers have embraced the new discourse available around quality and flavor and are beginning to understand and demystify what really is chocolate and embrace that it is an agricultural product. And as a result of all of that, and what really drew me into the industry as a developmental economist, the impact that this new industry has had financially on the cocoa farmers they purchase beans from has been astronomical. We are talking high impact direct relationships, and we're talking immediate and real income and revenue increases of 30 to 100% with cocoa prices that are often judged in multiples of the commodity price. And so here's why. It just so happens that when you only add beans and sugar, the most critical factor in producing really high quality chocolate is a farmer's efforts to producing really high quality cocoa beans. And in making high quality, properly fermented and dried cocoa is no easy task. Extra care has to be taken from all steps along the farming process, from harvesting pods at the right time to minute adjustments in fermentation and drying, all of which in their entirety take 2 weeks from the time of harvest. Commodity markets do not incentivize best practice, and I think just by virtue of what they are, they actually encourage the opposite. Commodity cocoa is never fermented because who on earth would waste 2 weeks doing something if no one paid for it? If you were to put commodity grade cocoa through a small batch process without chemicals or flavoring, the result would not be palatable. And because of this reality, and just as the pioneers of specialty coffee, and just as Aaron had mentioned earlier about his trip to El Salvador, the quest for good cocoa beans requires you to head south to establish a business relationship. It allows chocolate makers to have a supply of the highest quality, particularly cared for cocoa, and in turn, the farmer must be compensated a premium above the commodity price just to justify all the extra work that is demanded. This form of trade in cocoa and coffee specifically has been called an incentive-based reward system, and more romantically is referred to by chocolate and coffee folks as direct trade. And so what exactly is fair trade, and why is it not a commonly used supply chain in small batch chocolate and coffee? Well, the answer revolves entirely around quality. In the United States, fair trade is a certification and labeling scheme issued by the nonprofit Fair Trade USA, which audits supply chains, declaring trade fair in cocoa, coffee, bananas, tea, sugar, and a handful of other agriculture commodities. At the conception of fair trade, at the conception of the fair trade model for agriculture in the late 1980s, commodity markets were facing and dealing with drastically falling and volatile price markets. So fair trade's designation of a fair price for cocoa is merely $500 per metric ton increase over the commodity price, and it has no designations for quality. It is strictly just a price thing. And it is safe to assume that a fair trade cocoa bean is of no higher quality than an unfermented commodity cocoa bean. Also, that $500 per metric ton is not given to the individual farmer, but to the cooperative in which the farmer is a part of. Premiums are typically spent maintaining buildings and fixing cars, and historically has not made its way back to the farmer. Last year, we had an intern from Reed College here in Portland who wrote her thesis comparing these alternative trading methods, specifically in cocoa. We collected data from 4 cocoa farmers from Costa Rica, Honduras, and Nicaragua, and the average wage increase for the individual cocoa farmer working within this fair trade system over the traditional commodity market was 17 cents per month. While this comes from a very small set of sample data, the results do not scream fair to me. And while this is just an example from our experience, it seems to be an overwhelming consensus in the industry that the societal impacts of fair trade, specifically for cocoa, do not live up to the name. And I think it would be foolish to argue, and I'm certainly not arguing, that no good has come from the fair trade movement and its impact on the commodity market, and as a designation, and its role as a designation in teaching consumers to vote economically with their dollars. And at the same time, I think it's false to say that consumer perceptions of fair trade and its designation of being fair versus not have been an obstacle for a new emerging industry which is disrupting the current status quo of what actually is fair. And the moral of the story, I think, is labeling and what we demand of it will always be changing. And I think it changes alongside what is urgent and important to us at the moment. And that is it.
That's great.